All right, let's get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning for When Shit Goes Down, What to Do Next. We are so happy you could join us for today's session. I am Cody. I'm going to be hosting, and I'm going to be doing the Q&A and the chat box with my friend Nicole. So if you guys do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. If you have just general comments, just put them in the chat box there, and we'll make sure to get to those questions at the end. Or if it's really relevant to what we're talking about, I'll interrupt the guys and we'll go from there. Gene, Cameron, Travis, thank you so much for joining this morning. I appreciate it. If you guys want to do a quick intro on yourselves, that would be great. And then I'll let you guys get started.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Cody. And thanks so much for having me be a part of today's discussion. My name is Travis. I'm a sales engineer over here at IT Glue. Previously, before I came to IT Glue, I worked at an MSP, and even before that, in a little bit of corporate IT. And now I get to bring the value of documentation and making sure everything is standardized and consolidated down to our MSP partners.
Thanks, Travis. Also excited to be here. My name is Cameron Stone. I'm a solutions expert with Blackpoint Cyber. I've been talking about security to MSPs since before MSPs called themselves MSPs. We were all VARs back in the day. And my background is in first insurance, then PCI, and then I moved into the security space through Endpoint and now MDR.
Hi, I'm Gene Harmon. I'm also with Blackpoint, one of the senior sales and security engineers. Been in information security, cybersecurity for about 15 years, from law enforcement, military to an MSP, and now here at Blackpoint. So I love just talking about cybersecurity. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think we wanted to make this discussion a little bit more open. So I know we have a few slides up on the screen, but the real value that we're going to get out of today's presentation is just having Gene, Cam, and I just chatting about some of these things that we're seeing in the cyberspace and what happens when things go down. I think the thing that we need to understand is we need to get out of the idea that something won't happen. We have to get in the mindset of preparing for when it probably at some point will happen. Would you agree with that, with that, guys?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that, for a long time, the mindset was we just need to make sure that nothing bad ever happens. And the energy was all focused there. Now, looking back over the last 10 years, it's clear that even with the best posture out there, even with a very prepared stack of security tools and know-how, bad things happen. And so being prepared on that day makes all the difference.
Yeah, I think that
you definitely have to put as much thought into your prevention as you do your response. So they go hand in hand these days, for sure.
Totally. And I think that's where we really wanted to, as a team here, to start out with talking about what that response plan includes. So what are some types of incidents that can happen? If we have to plan and anticipate they happen, we should probably have a fairly comprehensive list on what those things might be. So what are some things that you guys think that are there different types of response plans, or should one response plan encompass everything? What are you guys' thoughts on that?
Now, you definitely want to have different response plans tailored to what you're having. A fire in a server room is far different than a ransomware activity that takes place. So you have to be prepared for both incidents, right? So you definitely might have a generic template that you start going over, and then you refine that as time goes on.
Right. I mean, big difference between responding to something in the news because a partner that you work with has some bad press versus now you're getting some really scary alerting from a customer site. How are we engaging with that customer directly? You want to make sure that you have a point person for generalized communication from the business to the businesses you work with, and then you have point people for the clients that you work with as well. For the more specific, hey, we have a scenario we're dealing with today with this one particular client.
Nice, love it. So yeah, so you kind of touched on vendor breaches. There's someone having something in the press, right? That's going to be a different type of of attack or response, as opposed to something that actually happens at your customer. Would you take different approaches to that, you think? Because one is a little bit more wait and see what happens, where one is a little bit more active, I would assume, but I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts on that.
It's a good question.
Yeah, so I'll take the first part. Definitely with a customer breach, you want to go through your full response plan on that particular customer. So you're going to have a lot more information at hand. And then I think Cameron has probably, we talked about it before, but your point about getting information, right?
Yeah, I mean, so we've had plenty of real life scenarios in the last couple months as far as vendor breaches are concerned. I think, from a Blackpoint perspective, what we need to do is actually understand fully what's going on in the marketplace before we put out a response. So we've seen a lot of people just jump right on the news day one and just start blabbing on about things when there isn't actually any data to be speaking about, right? When an RMM breach is going on, or there's specific tools that are breached, like, you need to know exactly what's going on before you can speak fluently on what's happening and what the best response is. So I think part of that is, even though you want to jump out there and you want to address every single question that's going to pop up proactively, it's important to actually be responding to information as opposed to just fear.
Exactly. I think it's important when you're communicating to the customer that's basing their decisions on fear, you approach it as the expert, gather your information, collect your thoughts, and then speak intelligently on the next steps. And it's okay to tell them you're looking into it, right? Don't try to just go through the lip service, so to speak.
I think what can earn you a lot of credibility too when you're having those discussions is to speak to stories about what's happened in the past, right? So every single bad piece of media that hits, like, you already have experiences with bad media in the past, and here's stories, and here's what that looks like, and you can break it down. Usually there's the initial press, which is very spooky, and then there is the practical press, which is, here's what we've actually seen, here are the consequences of what we've seen, and then here's our response, right? 1, 2, 3, and you can tell the history and the stories you've had in the past in responding just to step 1. And I think that lends credibility. You can establish yourself as the expert.
I love that. And I love how you talked about the press and how you react and have that line of communication. We're going to come to that in a second. And that's kind of what I've been really excited to hear from you guys about. But before we get there, I wanted to ask about, now that we've talked about the types of things that we'd like to build response plans to, what are the things that we actually need to include? So when I was building up response plans, both at the MSP I worked at and here at IT Glue, we have different types of things that could happen we need to respond to. We would, sit down and say, what are all the things that, could potentially happen? And we did that a few years ago. And so I wanted to know what you guys are thinking now, given the new landscape that we're in. What are things that response plans should include?
Well, the first point on the slide is key. Know your team, know your people who are involved. That includes the customer's team as well. So if you're looking at a customer-based incident, you need to know their landscape too. Who's going to be involved in that response? Who are your key contact points? And at 3 a.m., do you call the owner of the company? Do you call one of their on-site IT people? You have to decide that right away. So I think that's one of the starting points of any really good response plan, is knowing the framework that it's going to be built in.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that this is something that we've honed in here at IT Glue about. So IT Glue has a great documentation platform that allows this type of information to not only be stored as a plan, but also some of these key members, their contact information is sometimes changing. So with our solution, we are syncing that in from things like Office 365, as well as your ticketing tool. And so having this in a very concrete, list of, like, step 1, you're contacting this person, step 2, you're contacting this person, and then having that be a hyperlink to something like a ticketing system, so you can send out communication responses, or to their Office 365 to know their email addresses or escalation points, is really key. So I think sometimes we may when we're talking about people who need to be involved, we might write someone's name and then that person leaves. We might say contact Sally at reception when this happens, but really we should be kind of focusing on the role that plays. So is she the point of contact? We know that title is going to maybe be passed around, and through other functions in the business, we will update that, right?
So someone
in the
gets hit
military,
by the proverbial bus.
Saying, time and grade, right? So you have your ranks in the military, right? And then the position over grade. So position over grade is the person that's best positioned to do the job should do the job regardless of their rank. And that goes with the response plan on any level. So sometimes it's not necessarily the boss doing all the controlling of all the information. It's the best person positioned to do that response. And that should be clearly defined. And then if their contact information can be auto updated, I mean, that just makes it so much better.
Yeah, Travis, it's great you guys give structure to that conversation and in a way that understands the conversation is kind of ever changing.
Totally. It totally is. And then I think the second point here talks about what we just chatted about, the different types of incidents that occurred, and also maybe ranking them on severity is what I did when I was writing ours about, if it's on this scale, if it's, at the top here, we are going to be engaging a lot more people than if it's, some press came out about some company we use that's a very minimally impacting, but then obviously something like our RMM tool or our backup solution warrants a different type of response plan. I would assume, is that still true?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, you have to really score them to know. So you still have to respond to an antivirus alert cleaning something. So a quarantine's an event that's kind of low. It's doing its job. It's supposed to be. You still have to have some kind of response in place for that. Whereas if you have a virus escape from an antivirus or fail to quarantine, that's going to score higher on your threshold. So a full-blown response plan will have the whole gamut of those in-betweens.
Awesome. And then another area here, the third point here is about knowing which people are actually affected by them. And this is another area that I think sometimes people forget to note, right? A breach or an incident that happens on something like a finance application is going to affect different people as opposed to a production server that's stopping manufacturing or something, right? So understanding the different departments and who uses each of those solutions is really important. And so this is another kind of shameless plug here to IT Glue, is we want to focus on this as well, as what are the departments and use cases for these types of solutions and services that you're managing for your customer. And then of course you need to tie that back to your incident plan. And so it's not, like you said, always just going to the CEO or the boss with the problems. It's understanding that, well, if it's something to do with finance, we're going to the CFO, or if it's something to do with production, we're going to the operations manager or something like that.
And having that
I even think that's good to have. Oh, sorry go ahead, Cameron.
No, I was gonna say, and having that contact information is available, that's huge, because you can make every incident a teaching moment, or at least when someone was involved in the incident, you can make that a teaching moment. And the sooner that you're able to teach that moment, the fresher it's going to be, right? So if somebody's clicking on an email they shouldn't, and that's going to execute something malicious, if you see that mitigated or not, and you're responding to an incident, I think that's a great time to maybe have a phone call, maybe have, just a brief, hey, here's what we saw, here's what not to do next time.
Yeah, and I was going to add that knowing the departments that are going to be affected can really help you prevent some of these issues from happening. They know the software better than anyone. They use it on a daily basis. So someone that uses an ERP, to control logistics, supply chain, and then an IT guy comes in to try to set it up, you don't really know that product. You know how to set it up. You might read the documentation, but you don't know the ins and outs and the pains that they feel every day. So asking them straight up, how would you compromise the system, or how would you make your day worse off in the system, could really shore up some of those defenses as well. And then gets that conversation going for, later we'll talk about tabletop exercises, but starts that conversation path.
Totally. Great. Now, we've kind of touched on this in a little bit here, is that our response plan that we create does need to be documented. We need to have this information available, so we're not just making it up on the fly. Checklists, I love to see checklists here because that's one of the areas that IT-Glue helps to create. But I wanted to know from you guys, what are some of the other things that we haven't touched on that we should always include in the documentation part of a response plan?
Gene, I'm kicking to you on
the
that
documentation. Yeah, no problem. So you definitely want to have the workflow. You don't want someone to have to learn on the fly. So you need to have, the reason I love the checklist, and I used them in IT-Glue when I was at the MSP, is basically I want my tier 1 techs to know exactly what my advanced senior engineers know. And having that transfer of knowledge on the fly when the high stress information is not realistic. So you really want to have the step-by-steps. If we're going to image a server, well, have the backups linked into that checklist, right? Have that steps. Is it done? Check. Okay. And then what's the next part? You don't want them to have to guess what their next course of action is or have to learn something on the fly. Now, they can reference the documentation on it, but they shouldn't have to fully start embracing new concepts during a high stress incident. And that's the primary thing what you're trying to do, or primary incident you're trying to avoid in any incident response plan, is them searching for information when it's already kind of stressful. Those are the things I would always put in a response plan, whether it's a breach scenario, which we're kind of focusing on more, but even just disaster scenarios, like I mentioned before, fires, things, natural disasters.
Totally. And Samuel actually asked a really topical question on this in the Q&A here. He asked, just disappeared from me, let me grab it. Should our response plans be a part of the disaster recovery? So things like you mentioned, the fire, the water, or should it be part of an IT operations kind of run book? Or is it something that stands out on its own and could be executed at sort of any point?
Both, all of the above. So while disaster recovery plans, they need to be in place for the overall arching, the actual incident response plan is more the tactics based. How are you going to execute that plan? And really just need to have an IR for each incident and disaster that comes up.
Awesome. Perfect. All right. And then my favorite part, and the thing that is probably the hardest in every single business, is communication. And how do we ensure that everyone on our team is on the same page? I wanted to ask you guys, how do you guys see communication take place when it comes to doing disaster recovery, and how they interact with you at Blackpoint, how the MSP interacts with that as well?
Yeah, I mean, so the key part about communication is like, you don't want to figure out whose responsibilities is whose on the day of, right? You want to know who's your go-to on the day of. And like, so at Blackpoint, we're doing a lot of active mitigation on behalf of our partners, right? As an MDR, we're standing there, we're doing the response. Oftentimes we need customer buy-in, or we've got a couple additional steps to really shore up a network. So having all of your emergency contacts defined so that, at any time of day, we can reach out and actually get that person on the line so that they can help us along is key.
Yeah, and that's top-down communication is super important. So we've had incidents where we came into, we're trying to respond to a major threat inside a network, and we fill out run books and playbooks and things of that nature, but the contact on the other end has no clue who we are. Kind of frustrating. You have your fingers on the button ready to detain an endpoint. You need approval, but the guy you called is an outsourced IT company doing their job. We taught them, don't get phished, right? So they're trying to verify that we're who we say we are. They have no clue. So you really need that top-down communication. If someone's going to be answering the phone, they need to know everything about your incident response plans and the vendors involved in it, and make it part of your playbook, your hands-on playbook.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could you kind of summarize a little bit about how that interaction works between Blackpoint and the MSP or someone like yourselves, just to, because like you mentioned there, and we haven't quite talked about this yet, is there is a bit of a handoff, right? There is a vendor that you take some of it and the MSP takes some. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
We let the partner define
Yes.
the relationship. So when they bring a customer on board, they're then filling out a playbook that tells us how we're allowed to interact. And that's really where we see things move really smoothly or not, right? Because they're either communicating us as a whitelisted detection and response offering that they're giving, right? The 24-hour threat response, or they're identifying us as a partner that they work alongside to be able to give that 24/7 response. And so when they're defining who the emergency contacts are in that playbook, they're either just including themselves or they're including people with the customer that we can reach out to in the event of an incident. So that's really where communication is key beforehand. We don't want, what Gene is saying is, we don't want to have to introduce ourselves to the client when there's an active breach. We want them to know we're a partner fighting alongside of them, or we want the MSP to be able to communicate clearly that there's an incident and then work alongside of our team, in an active partnership.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I think that transitions well to that first point, that tabletop exercises there. So we're pretty transparent with our vendor client relationship. We want that partnership there. So we're talking about this constantly, but you need to make sure your vendor's also talking about that if they're not broaching the subject already. So, maybe pull them in on the tabletop exercises and the actual, mock scenarios that you can kind of develop, and pull a vendor representative in and say, okay, here's how we would respond. This is what we're going to do in this scenario, and get an example of that. Whether it's an email, a phone call, just get the cadence down, right? And that will help smooth that process out a lot.
Awesome.
And a lot of the value of a tabletop exercise, sitting down with your team and going through the scenario of an incident, is then when the incident hits, it's not your first time. You're getting a lot of that troubleshooting out of the way beforehand, right? And that's a lot of what education is. So, definitely something, even though if it seems silly to just deal in hypothetical scenarios, I think it's time well spent.
I agree. We do these here at IT Glue for some of the different types of responses. They're not all major incidents. There's lots of exceptions that happen in any business. So I do this in my role here, even in pre-sales, is having to do these types of tabletop exercises, and maybe not to this full extent. But another thing that we do that's also really important is our retrospect, to have meetings after if unfortunately an event does happen, and we know eventually it will happen, to sit down and spend a lot of time and say, what didn't we anticipate happening? And we need to, take notes to include something similar to that, or we foresaw something that could have happened, and include that in our next tabletop exercises hypothetical, now that we have more ideas on what potentially could happen.
Exactly. Kelly, I see your question. Kelly's asking for some sample run books to get copies of, or to see the playbook. And if you work with me after this call, I'm happy to get you any of those documentations and kind of walk you through what that looks like. Get you the playbook's a relatively short thing, but we can walk through how to implement it correctly.
Yeah, and Travis, I love that point where you did the post-mortem analysis of something there.
Yep.
Because that's good to do even when you did everything perfectly, right? So review, like a good quarterback reviews his plays, right? So it's the same process. If you want to get better at something, look at what you did well and what you can improve upon, even in scenarios that are maybe low touch, not as high stress, and then go back and say, okay, what if we didn't get it at this point and it escalated up? And that's a great way to develop tabletop exercises as well, where you can kind of go backwards and say, okay, well, we stopped this. We found that the backups weren't running at this time. We fixed that. But what if the disaster did happen and that backup failed, or a hacker breached the network and we had to go back? What's our next response? What do we do next? And then you put yourself in these what if scenarios that are built upon real life, and you can start talking about that customer specifically, and then you say, oh, I don't know this area, let me go fill that gap in my incident response plan, because it is a living, breathing document. It's not usually a one and done scenario. You probably want to revisit it often.
If you want to introduce like some randomness in it, you can use a 20-sided dice as well. See how the outcome was. Oh,
Yep.
Didn't work. Let's jump forward.
Yeah, there's actually a game that Black Hills Cyber Information Security, they came out with it called breaches, data breaches or something like that. It's a card game that you flip over and it gives you different sets where you can play this game with the dice and everything like that, and it comes out.
I love my gamers.
Where it makes it more of a fun. It's a
great idea.
It's the best nerdy thing to test. Yeah.
Right. Oh, I love that. We should do that. We should do that like a Zoom game, a Zoom like happy hour. We'll do that.
I'm in.
And we kind of talked about this already, but also we talked about communication as the previous slide, we were focusing more on communication to our internal team, but we also did just talk about how we have to communicate to our customers and make sure they understand that we are working with a partner, or that we have this setup between someone like yourself and us as the MSP. But there also needs, if you are bringing it back to the communication is being held on the MSP, there is some things you need to be aware of. And I love the first point here is don't go full nerd. I know that's something I like to go as soon as I get some detail about something that's happening, as I just blurt out exactly what I know.
Yeah, I mean, and especially when emotions get involved, right? We want to just start talking. We want to make sure that we're sharing. Honesty is key, but I think that research before honesty is really important. And, that I said it at the very beginning, but I think a lot of times you see a logo pop in the news and, oh my goodness, that's something that I use. We got to get in front of this. We got to talk to all the customers. It's like, well, let's figure out exactly what happened. Because a lot of times communication is happening to the media before even the vendor might know what's going on. And so, making sure you know exactly what's going on before you get in front of your customer and start having that deeper discussion. Just make sure you have answers to questions. I think that's key. And then reiterating your value, right? It's a great time to say, look, this is why you hired me, right? We're the experts and we're doing everything that we can. Always good to add that reassurance and then to establish your credibility in that moment.
And that's always good to fall back on those previous slides. That's why we did all this beforehand. We're ready for these, we're prepared, we're trained, you're trained, and then everyone's involved in this conversation. So you're preparing them way in advance to any incident happening, that the possibility is always there. We're making sure we're on top of it. So it buys into that trust factor a lot more.
Totally. And so we started off today's talk understanding that we need to, as managed service providers, make a shift from putting up a defense and trying to stop the attack to understanding that a breach is likely inevitable. How do we now bring that down to our customers and have that conversation? Because it's a really tough conversation to have to people. And this is probably also going to be tied to this communication plan. It's very delicate. I'm curious your guys' thoughts on that.
Yeah, I got, the first thing I always say, because this question comes up quite a bit, is refer back to the people that have millions of dollars of budget, right? They're all being breached. Higher threat landscape, or higher threat footprint, of course, they're targeted more, but they're pumping millions upon millions of dollars in. Their IT budget's small, and then their security budget's probably smaller still. So trying to explain it that way, they're pumping all this money in. We couldn't afford to do that. They're still getting breached. We need to use our resources wisely and prepare for the worst. It's just the reality of the world these days.
I always come at it from a narrative context where, especially with cybersecurity, it's like, let's just frame it as there's a war going on that people don't like to talk about. And the main target is the backbone of the American economy, which more and more is small to medium-sized businesses. And you're seeing more and more impressive threat actors stepping in on the attacking side. So let's have a real conversation about what it is to have a good stack of security, right? Which is where usually that's my part of the conversation. I think there's also another part of the conversation is what happens if the worst happens, and that's really where you want to have a conversation about insurance before bad things happen.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think that leads right next into our next slide here, and that's take back our businesses from cyber criminals. So that's not only us as managed service providers, but this is the promise that we give to our customers, is that we are going to protect them and make sure that they're successful in this economy that demands that they adopt technology. And I think,
prevention is key, right? We're here today to talk about what happens when shit goes down, but really our job is to make sure shit doesn't go down. And that's why you're putting the documentation in place. That's why you're making sure you know who all your contacts are and you're using IT glue. That's why you're leveraging partners like Blackpoint Cyber to make sure that there's security experts looking at all of the data necessary to get full context of your environment to be able to take a response 24/7. But there's also some really easy to implement, tips that we'll be talking through today.
Totally. And and Gene, you kind of hit on this one about, making sure that you don't suffer as much financial loss as potential with getting in front of that with insurance, right?
Yeah, you definitely want to get insured for just to cover that last line of defense, right? So,
and if an MSP is playing CTO, I think that's absolutely an appropriate conversation for you to have with your customer. That they might be paying you so that you don't need insurance, but really at the end of the day, insurance covers them on the worst day. It also helps cover you and indemnify you in the event of ransom.
Very true.
Because having that conversation can prevent that.
It's so expensive to clean up with this.
Right. And having that conversation can help prevent you from sitting across the aisle in a courtroom from your customer.
And funny you bring that up, because that's what I always used to picture. I'd always picture, what am I going to put in place to justify to the court and to the family members why their livelihoods are taken away. So when I picture developing a response plan, when I picture developing a stack, when I picture any of these topics of cybersecurity, especially, and we take it super seriously because of this fact, we want to justify to our customers, we did everything in our power to prevent their business ruin, right? Because that's what happens at the end of the day. And we'd be remiss if we didn't include insurance into something along those lines.
Due diligence and due care is and being able to prove that is so important. Now we always we talked about prevention is always at top of mind. That's usually always the first line of defense, and that's the way it has been for the past 25, 30, 40 years almost now we're seeing. But what are some of the ways that we want to do prevention that we sometimes forget? Because I know we've been talking a lot about post incident, but let's take some time and talk about what happens to prevent it in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. Scanning for vulnerabilities. Know your threat footprint. Where you're vulnerable is key. So I'm going to use the SolarWinds Orion example just because it's fresh on the mind. But when you're worried about that one, but you're running a 2007 Windows box or 2008 non-R2 box, or even the R2 boxes now, and you haven't shored up that vulnerability, but you're worried about a 0-day, your priorities a little skewed. So we really need to start talking about where the risk actually lies in your organization. So scanning for vulnerabilities, know your shadow IT infrastructure, the shadow IT being the assets you just don't know about existing in the environment. All that is huge for me. Reducing access, but you can't reduce access until you know it's there.
And when you're talking through potential vulnerabilities, right? And you're talking through your overall security approach. Important to have a deep conversation up front, but then important to have a continued conversation with them, right? I think quarterly business reviews are a great idea. Some people do monthly. It's not a bad idea. I think that you should always be talking around the version of the service that you're providing because if you're offering the same IT services today that you were offering 5 years ago, you're running a 5-year-old version of your business in an ever-changing landscape. And so speaking through the changes of those landscapes fluently to your customer, I think keeps you out of a lot of trouble. Because, I mean, what we're seeing, the top MSPs do are pivot their strategy regularly in order to stay on top of what's relevant. What Gene said is great, which is you should also know sort of what your likelihoods of breach are based on all of the different access points that you're giving to the world. You might be super stressed out about making sure you're on top of that 0 day as it comes in, but then you're running retired infrastructure that hasn't been patched in years. Making sure that you take that holistic approach to security helps you with those cost benefit analysis calls that you have to make when you're layering protection on for your clients and you're trying to determine what that latest version of your security is to your clients. And I think that documentation plays a big role in that as well, making sure that you've got everything written down and that you're tracking all of those changes to each respective client.
Yeah, I love, Gene, that you brought up shadow IT, because that's such a big thing that I think is really just blown up, and we didn't think about it. I think there was, especially the work from home has brought that up and just, magnified it so much. I've been talking to so many of my customers. One of the products that we sell is a network discovery tool to try and eliminate that. So I've been having so many conversations with people that said, you know what, in probably around this time last year, I had I couldn't get laptops. And I had everyone running out to Staples. They were buying Surfaces, iPads, because they needed to work from home. Now those devices, the wireless printers, the Alexas, are making their way back into the corporate network as people head back into the office, and they're just plugging them into the network and, not even thinking to let you know about those things. And it's a harder conversation to have because people have been, getting used to that workflow, being able to have Alexa in the conference room to answer questions about stock prices or whatever it is, but or having their Surface that's a little bit more user friendly. But that is really, taking it back. We have to almost go back to the basics and talk to people about the things we told them, 5-10 years ago. But you can't bring your stuff to the office. This is not a BYOD for these reasons.
We lost our perimeter almost a year ago in most environments. Reestablishing that perimeter is going to be a lift.
Yeah, totally. And when we lost that perimeter, we sort of, or when we had the perimeter set up, we kind of moved into this idea of things that kind of default getting through. So we talked about email because there's kind of an inherent trust that we want to receive incoming communication. Same thing with social engineering, receiving inbound phone calls. But this isn't to say that, we go back and just focus on the perimeter, but we also need to focus on things like this as well, right?
Yeah, it seems like the cloud is definitely an easy entry point.
Huge.
Yeah. We're seeing more and more phishing campaigns devoted to 365.
And the Dropboxes and the Google Drives of the world, they create a more complex talking point at some point, because you really a lot of companies aren't putting the controls necessary in place. But starting with the email security with O365 and then G Suite, you can start broaching that subject as well. Teach your users about the phishing concerns, but also how are they sharing these Dropbox links? How are they sharing these different files out as well? Because it all boils down to training at that point. You really need to train your users.
We also live in this stuff all day. I feel like our exposure to different types of fraud is it almost cheapens our perspective a little bit. It's important to start at the basics of gift card emails. Don't forget to emphasize to be untrustworthy of any request for quick money that you're not supposed to tell people about, because they're still the most prevalent one. The easiest ones are often the ones that get through.
Yeah, that last one where it says, when in doubt, call the sender, I think will prevent more scam responses than anything.
Yep.
When in doubt, just go analog. It's just the face-to-face conversation, or you pick up the phone. And that should be a company-wide policy that you talk to your customers about, that you talk to your employees about right from the start. I'm never going to ask you to wire money over email. I'm never going to ask you to get a gift card over email, or whatever else over email. Like, put these policies in place right away and have the conversation early and often.
Right. Make it a policy, and make that a part of your training.
What, so you guys are saying you're never going to send me a Tim Hortons gift card for my morning coffee when we do these webinars? All right. Passwords. This is also, I think we all know this, but also just, keeping on that discussion that we need to go back to basics and always just hammer it in. We might think that people know this, but our memory can easily be lost.
We love to think that everyone knows this at this point, but we're seeing otherwise in the wild, right? So we're still seeing accounts go without MFA and 2FA, and at this point, it's almost not optional. If you're not starting the process of enabling two-factor company-wide, you're behind at this point. Strong passwords definitely be used. Password management has to kind of be incorporated into this. You don't want users to start coming up with their own passwords. That's where things start disconnecting. So password management with 2FA, MFA, preferably app-based MFA versus SMS and email, and strong passwords using totally unique passwords throughout the infrastructure. The other one on this list, create a reasonable password rotation. So the 90-day password scheme, it works. But the problem that you have with users is what ends up happening is they're in the middle of their day. They're frustrated trying to get something done on time, and then their password expires. Then they try the complex password variant. It says, oh, you're missing this exclamation point in this spot here or whatnot. So what do? They fall back on their old password habits and put the easiest password that meets the password complexity requirements and the minimum length, right? And that what it ends up creating is this huge password reuse, even if it's slightly changed, that as those passwords get leaked over time, it defeats the purpose of the password rotation. So having that password, the strong passwords in there with password management, huge for an organization's security. So yeah, that's what I obviously I have an opinion on passwords, but that's my take on these.
I like that we have here that you need to have a reasonable rotation schedule, because there are different levels of access, right? Your domain admin credential needs to have a different policy than access to your some bonus system or something that has just like one sliver of information, but access into your entire domain, completely different monster than something else. So having that reasonable policy that includes everything such as multi-factor authentication, strong passphrases, rotation if needed, and then the easiest way to do this is with the password management solution. It does have to be for shared credentials, because as much as we're trying to get away from that, shared credentials still need to be around. Having solutions like IT Glue to keep track of those, generate strong passwords for you, let you know when they haven't been changed in a while, when people have accessed them, when they leave and they need to be rotated, or it's definitely good things to have to included in your password policy.
Yeah, that was one thing I loved about IT Glue is the notification of, hey, 30 days out, this password is aging, change it, things like that. It was, you just run a simple report and you had all your information there.
Totally.
Yeah, those shared passwords can be a nightmare, especially with the MFA 2FA. But yeah, it's definitely, those need to be your crown jewels, and security is not convenient. If you're going to be an admin in the environment, you have to take the brunt of that because you have so much responsibility.
Totally. All right, now patching, and when we were on our pre-call, I love that when we put this slide together, we put servers and workstations at the last thing of patching. But I wanted you to hear your guys' thoughts on patching of other types of things like firewalls and applications.
Yeah, I think it has to be on a cadence that you start off with firewall switches just to get those done. And then you have to decide your cadence. What I usually do is a 90-day cadence on firewalls, and then applications directly is a 60 to 90-day cadence, and workstations are 30 days. With servers being, depending on the server, you can kind of rotate into that framework somewhat. But you have to have someone in your organization taking ownership of that, because there is a lot to patching. It's not just you turn it on and let it run, because bad patches do happen. So using the documentation to track when these are due and when they come up is highly important. Whether you use IT Glue or a spreadsheet, but I would choose one over the other. It's highly important to track all that information and get someone to take ownership of it.
Totally. Yeah, and we can't underestimate this. This is kind of, I think MSP 101, but like you said, people are still doing it. We need to just, reiterate that and hit it home. And Cameron, I wanted to ask you about some of the things we need to remember about antivirus, and that this is, even though this is, again, kind of 101 and we might think past it, we always need to keep this as one of our lines of defenses.
Yeah, I always group antivirus and EDR in together. Same difference to me, but essentially your antivirus is leveraging machine learning to like auto respond, auto categorize, and then mitigate what's going on within your environment. It's absolutely something that you need, especially because if you ever do end up across the aisle from your client in a courtroom, like antivirus is one of those like key things that even a jury knows that you need. So skimping on antivirus is definitely not something that you can do. However, machine learning has its downfalls as well. The biggest issue with antivirus is that an antivirus, because it's automatically responding, you can get into trouble if there's a false positive. And like, take it from me, who worked for an antivirus firm for 5 years. A false positive is the worst day of your life, because every single one of your partners is angry at you at the same time. And so you're configuring that machine learning to avoid any false positive. And what that means is that you end up missing anything that looks like an IT representative within your environment. So if intrusion has taken place, your antivirus usually isn't a very effective tool. And that's because they look like you when they're in the environment. That's when you need a solution like MDR to really highlight what's going on, to be able to do the threat hunting necessary to get the context of the full environment and what's going on within the environment, looking at snapshots of the created processes within that environment, and then making a response where you're killing processes manually, right? But the problem is a real response to an intrusion usually takes hands on keyboards and eyes on glass. Antivirus is a must-have. Just know there are holes within any automated security posture, and that's just because of the fear of that false positive, right? And the limited reporting that it's going to be able to do on a scenario. So I would partner your antivirus with Blackpoint.
Awesome.
Anything to add, guys?
No, you covered it, hit it the nail on the head. False positives being a key, and then there's always been ways to circumvent the AV. It's just not foolproof. It would be really hard to make the 100% antivirus, especially if you don't use any malware.
Sam just had a great question. What's MDR versus EDR? And are they complementary? Yeah, EDR is glorified antivirus, right? The EDR is like what happens when marketing people get with product people, and like, how do we charge more for antivirus? How do we make better alerting for antivirus? EDR is more on the antivirus side. MDR is, well, there's a lot of different iterations of MDR. To me, a real MDR is a platform built from the ground up to do alerting on any indication of breach or any high consequence action, meaning that you're just basically looking at what IT representatives are doing within the environment to make sure that they're not bad actors, and then to look at any flag that shows there's tradecraft being utilized in the environment. And then you're passing that information off to a trained SOC that then has access to all the context they need to do the threat hunting and then to respond. And the key part of managed detection and response is the response part. Like, what is it that the SOC is enabled to do? At Blackpoint, we're killing processes, we're detaining endpoints.
Awesome. And I know you guys have a lot of info coming up because you guys are having a product update to dive in more into how you guys are to managing this. And so I'm really excited that you guys are able to share some more info about this. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you guys have coming up, what you guys do?
Sure. Well,
up here?
We've got a product update coming up this month. If you're interested, you can register here. That's going to basically go through some additional integrations that we have, some exciting stuff we have on the docket from our solution suite perspective. On the right, we have a cybersecurity gut check. So if you're interested at all in your security posture and how you can improve it, you can get a trial of our platform just to have a SOC engineer deep dive into your environment and really understand what those vulnerabilities are, go through any alerts we have, both from an indications of breach perspective, but also just a high consequence action perspective, to understand the context, understand your stack, and understand how to better respond. So yeah, scan there and you can have a deeper conversation with us, and Gene being the engineer who can kind of deep dive into the threat hunting and response we do, me a little bit more salesy.
Awesome.
Yep. And then
I know we have a few questions and we're going to get to that in just a second. Just while
that's what I keep looking at.
Yeah, I know. I keep seeing your eyes go down there and I'm like, I just have one more thing I want to get to before there. So, here at IT Glue, I know some of you are already customers of us. So we do have a few events coming up as well. It is, we're still in this virtual world, a lot to take in. I'm going to be hosting a webinar in just a few days here about what tools you need for rapid service delivery. So how are you going to get things accomplished very quickly? How do you execute all the things we just talked about today very quickly? This is in addition to our MSP Mastered certification that Kaseya is hosting. This is a great opportunity to dive in and chat and get to know some of Eric Simpson's strategies around how to master an MSP. So zooming out a little bit to documentation and process improvement, as well as MSP operation, we have a few links for that. So you can check those out either at itcomplete.com/certification or at it2.com/rapid-service. Now, I know that the big point here, we have a lot of questions about what Blackpoint is and some things like that. So I wanted to turn it over to Q&A so that we can get through some of those questions for our listeners.
Zero trust solutions along with AV or replacing AV. Zero trust, like a threat locker, probably.
Threat locker. Yeah, things like that. It's definitely
not replacing it
for me.
Yeah. And antivirus, you have to have, like the courtroom scenario. Like you can't not have antivirus, just because if you need to explain to a jury what your solution stack is, like antivirus is the one that people understand. It's not really a place to skimp. Even though there's holes with an automated posture, you need one. Not to say we don't like zero trust, because I think it can be powerful.
Yeah, it makes it a lot harder to hack. I will say that, but it's not impossible to get around zero trust solutions. It's it becomes a headache and exactly what you want to have happen, and it slows down the process greatly. But it's not the end all be all that's going to solve all security concerns. Maybe if Microsoft did it as a whole, it could help because they have the largest sample size of trust models, but it's going to be a slow cook for sure. It's not something that in this day and age is a valid solution to replace AV.
Jonathan
What else
asks,
do we
will we
have
be
here?
receiving follow-up emails and links? Yes. IT Glue is going to be hosting it. I think it's in the chat.
Yeah, so we'll be sending out
I'll drop that again.
Yeah, an email with the follow-up to this recording, and that's itglue.com/when S happens. So we will post that out. That's at the very bottom of the slide as well. So you'll be seeing a follow-up email. You can also let anyone know who didn't, who registered for this but wasn't able to attend. They'll also be getting that here. So yeah, that's the link for the follow-up recording. Wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. Closing thoughts. I'll go around and say that I think that 2020 has taught us a lot, and it's really shifted our focus. We talked about the perimeter, we talked about the new landscape and having to continually evolve, and we can't just stick in our old version of our MSP that we were 5 years ago. And we need to look at making sure that we are set up and prepared for when things actually do happen. Guys, what do you guys think? What are your kind of takeaways from today?
First of all, this was really fun. I'm glad we did this. I think we should probably do more. There's a lot of topics that we can have fun conversations about. Kelly, I'll email you and your questions. Happy to do that. That link isn't going to work yet, but it will work when we get the email out to you guys. So I just wanted to make sure you had a place to go. And as far as security is concerned, just know, look, we're all in this together, right? So make sure to leverage your vendors in these conversations. We can help you have conversations with your clients about the fact that the landscape is changing, and your approach should too. I think a lot of times people get kind of stuck in their stack, and because they're used to selling something to their customer, they think that's what needs to continue to happen. I think that staying open to change really helps kind of move those conversations along, and helps open your clients up to change as well.
Yeah, and I'd say, go back to your basics. IT hygiene is super important, even with all the cool bells and whistles. And adding the stack up and everything, but stick to the basics as well. Get your networks in check. Use your segmentation appropriately. And definitely don't buy into too many trends in the FUD market, right? Look at what's realistic to do and achievable in this day and age.
Shit does happen. Just be prepared for it, and that way the FUD doesn't work, right? As long as you're prepared, you shouldn't be full of fear.
Love it, guys. Thanks so much. This is a great conversation. Like I said, I think we need to do this more often. I really wanted to thank you guys for coming on. And yeah, have a great day, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, Travis. You've been great, man.
See you, everyone.